My mother had this lifelong goal of opening up an eatery. Well, she did it, but unfortunately she did not get to see how beautiful it blossomed to because she passed away. But what I was left with afterwards absolutely rocked me to my core, because my father gets a new woman almost instantly, and instead of me running the eatery, which I always ran with my mom, he put her in charge and sent me away to go to some school that I don't even want to go to, with a fake promise that after 1 year I can come back and run the eatery. Well, guess what? A year's up and he has changed his mind, so I'm coming for revenge. I have a belief that humans are the wickedest of creatures in the universe. My mother is late, and I have a father who does not live up to that title. I'm the only child of my parents, and this is not because my mother passed away. My father had told my mom from the onset about his desire to have just one child. This was when my dad was young and broke. The story is way different now, but I would need to go right where it started so you can understand the whole situation. My mother never went to college. She worked at a restaurant owned by her family, and her family was not rich. It was the only business that they owned, and her path crossed with my dad when he came around and things took off from there. My father was a college guy in his final years, and my grandparents were not in support of the relationship, though. They left my mother to make her decisions since she was old enough. This was something my mother would live to regret. My parents got married, and my mother moved in to live with them. They relocated, and my mother was the first to get a job, while my dad stayed jobless, and my mother carried the family on her shoulders. The early year of their marriage was great. They would share ideas, and my mother would often express her desire to establish a restaurant, just like the one her family owned. My dad was very supportive, and he suggested that they saved up a little money to start up the eatery, which was my mother's dream, and that's how they started Sweet Sensation. My father soon got a job as a real estate agent in an agency, and he could no longer be present in the business that he had established with my mom, so he just left the whole thing for her. Besides, he was doing well in his workplace and the pay was good. Sweet Sensation began to blossom at a quick pace the moment my mother became the sole manager. Before long, it became known around the neighborhood where we lived. It was during this time that I was born. My parents were now at a place of comfort, so I did not need to experience the hardship which they both had endured. We were a perfect family till I turned 5 years. My mother had begun pushing for another child as she felt the reason my dad wanted just a child was because they were poor. But my father was not in support of this idea. This was not because they were still poor. My father was making good money, and he and Mom was joint owner of a flourishing business, but he claimed he wanted a child so he could be actively involved in that child's life, something which would not be very possible if there were other kids in the picture as well. My father's attitude towards Mom started changing over the years as I grew into a teenager. He used his sharp tongue, which helped him win over clients to win the heart of ladies. This was how he spent the money which came his way. He stopped doing so in hiding and was unapologetic about it, and if my mother ever brought up the issue, he would ask her to leave if she was so tired of the marriage, and she was to leave without me. My mother remained, and the matter went from causing emotional trauma to verbal abuse. It did not get better. It became physical. There were times when I would see him abusing and assaulting, and even temptation to fight him came. I never yielded, though. My mother made the mistake of staying, and she felt she was doing it for me and my love. She had an idea of what she wanted her family to look like, and she did not want me to live my life in enmity with my father. She refused to come to terms that the home was already broken just like her heart was. Her health began to decline. With all these things that my father did, it was a wonder it took so long before telling my mother's health was bad. She was admitted to the hospital when my father started talking about a divorce, and she passed away while admitted to the hospital. The passing of my mom was not easy for me. My father mourned her death too, and I was surprised. I never thought someone who was talking about separation from his wife would be crying after he had been separated from her by death. He went sober for a year after that. He temporarily stopped his womanizing. I don't know if it was to honor the death of my mother, who he, quote, missed, or if it was to avoid people looking at him as an unfaithful husband. I graduated from college at the time, but I lived with him while I managed Sweet Sensation. 1 year passed, and though he did not get back to that kind of promiscuous life that he led, he began bringing a particular young lady called Bernice to the house. Bernice is older than me, but the age difference is not that much. I was 24 years while she was 29 at the time. I did not pay much attention the first time I saw her at the house because I suspected she could be one of the ladies my father brought to warm his bed. Something I felt he was free to do since, he's single. I, however, began suspecting it was more than a fling when the face of Bernice became a consistent one in the house. My father called me into his room one evening after I had returned from work, and he wanted to formally introduce me to Bernice. My father talked about how I had been a year since his wife passed. Though her passing made him realize his error in being a husband, he could not remain single forever, and he was just 55. He then declared his intention to get married to Bernice and be a loving husband to her. I was offended, but I did not show it. He had killed my mother, and was now talking about how her death had changed him and all. What good was this speech when it wasn't going to bring her back from the dead? Besides my vexation about my dad now being a, quote, changed man, after causing the death of my mother, the impression I had about Bernice was not a nice one, and, well, that was because of the attitude she had put up. For someone who was aiming to get married to a man, the least she could do was bond with his son. She rather carried herself about like she owned the place. Besides, she was way younger than my dad, and stories about young ladies getting married to older men for money were rampant. I did not believe she was getting married to my father simply for love. It wasn't happening. I did not express my feelings of doubts for my dad. I just told him he was free to get married if he wanted to. Bernice and my dad got married, and we began locking horns the moment she moved into the house. She wanted to ride everyone. My dad treated her like she was the only woman in the world, and he could lose her if he misbehaved. It was super irritating to me. The more I saw him submit to her will, the more I got reminded of my mother and the more resentment I had in my life towards him and his wife. My mother would definitely be alive if he had not kept treating her the way he did his first wife. I know most people are of the opinion that one should respect his father's wife, and I did that. The problem came from the other end. Bernice did not respect herself. She was exceeding her boundaries, and the height of it was when my dad called me and said I lacked the necessary qualities and qualifications to manage the eatery. Well, I was shocked, because I had been doing so ever since my mother died, and things had been going great. Never for once did he complain about the way I ran the affairs at Sweet Sensation, or the turnover. It was when he was done with his speech that I knew Bernice had been the orchestrator behind everything. My dad told me I needed to go to a culinary school, where I would not just be taught how to cook, but how to manage an eatery. He had one in mind, and his suggestion was a school that was outside of the States. I did not deserve what he was doing to me. Managing a business has nothing to do with one's cooking ability. This was something I had proven, as I am not a good cook, but the business thrived under my management. Well, I tried convincing him about the idea of being a chef before I could manage a business, which was my late mother's idea, but he was stubborn in a subtle way and claimed it was for the best. I asked, what would become of the business if I went to culinary school, and he said Bernice would be managing it. Well, I was alarmed by the statement. How could he say Bernice would manage it? She had never been to culinary school, and neither was she a chef. My father knew I was going to question the whole thing, and he said the arrangement was only temporary. He claimed she was only filling in for me so I could return better equipped to manage the business.
Well, it dawned on me that Bernice had inspired my father into the decision. She was right there with us, and I saw the look of victory and satisfaction on her face. The drama that day made me understand that my father was under the strong influence of my stepmom, and this was because he was still thrilled by the euphoria of having a new wife. Bernice did not have a job that I knew of, and my father had made some calls here and there to set her up with a job, but Bernice declined all the offers she got. She told my father she was not ready for a job and wanted to stay at home for a year and play the role of a good housewife. A role that she sucked at. I can basically count the number of times she cooked for my dad, and though he did not complain, I could tell he was not impressed with it, as he always did not eat much. My dad loves food, by the way. Well, my dad had let Bernice have her way in being a good housewife that could not cook or clean the home. He just lavished money on her, and this included proceeds from Sweet Sensation. She had visited the eatery a couple of times, and after seeing how great things were going, she decides she wants to manage it. This was less than 3 months after she said that she wanted to be a stay-at-home wife for a year. How convenient for her to suddenly change her mind. My father remained blind to this physical manifestation of greed. So, I go to the culinary school, and the program lasted for a year. My dad never called me through my stay there, and the few times that I tried reaching out to him, he never responded with enthusiasm. I went home after the program ended, and I was now a certified chef. A criterion my father had insisted I needed to meet if I was going to continue managing Sweet Sensation. I met a surprise when I got home. Bernice had given birth to a boy. I had a stepbrother. For a man who had insisted on having more than one child, my dad seemed like a hypocrite to me. Bernice was not happy I had returned home. I could tell by her behavior. My return meant she was going to leave the managerial position which she had held for the past year, while I was being trained to be a chef, an idea that she had inspired. I was eager to visit Sweet Sensation, as it's been a while, and I was disappointed when I got there. Let me tell you, it was in shambles. I'd been getting calls from the staff that worked there while I was in culinary school. They said things were not great at the eatery, and some of them even noted their desire to resign. I believe things were bad. I just didn't know it was worse than I ever imagined. There was a serious decline in the patronage. This affected everything. The returns were no longer returning, and some workers had been laid off to reduce the expenses being made. To make matters worse, Bernice, who was the manager, was not willing to take advice or suggestions from those around. She saw that as a rebellion and rewarded it by laying the person off. Her concern was the sales that were made for the day. Well, Bernice was having the time of her life. My father had taken his hands off the eatery the moment she assumed the managerial position, and she never gave him any feedback on the progress of things. It was not like he cared anyways. I did not want to directly confront Bernice, so I decided to first speak with my father. I met him 3 days after I had returned to ask him when the handover would be done. That is when I would take over the managerial position of Sweet Sensation. My father said I had just gotten back and it's far too soon to be looking for a return. He did promise we would talk about it in the upcoming days. I know evasion when I see one, and I was certain my father was being evasive. I did not push the matter, though. I made up my mind to wait for 2 weeks before bringing up the subject again. During my period of waiting, I would often go down to the eatery just to observe things. Bernice, who was keeping a close watch on me, began getting agitated by my presence at Sweet Sensation. It got to a point she could no longer contain, and she openly confronted me to ask that I quit showing up at the eatery, as I had no business being there. I was mad. I had tried to contain my anger towards her ever since the day she showed up at the house, but that was the limit I could go. How could she tell me that I had no business in my family's business? Where was she when my mother had inspired my dad into starting up the business she is now killing? So, I told her that I had been coming around to observe her failure in running the place. Bernice was infuriated, but so was I. We soon began arguing in the midst of customers and clients. It was a mess. I reminded her that her position as a manager was coming to an end, as I'm back and ready to bring Sweet Sensation back to life it deserves. At this point, Bernice began screaming like the madwoman she was. The moment I observed people staring, I just quit and left the building. I was so angry that I could not wait for my father to return. I could no longer wait for some time before we had the handover discussion. My father got home and Bernice was with him. I was too angry to be surprised. I knew Bernice would have told him lots of lies to spurn him into tearing me to shreds, but I didn't care. I had barely opened my mouth to vent my grievances when he started shouting at me for insulting his wife. I told my father she had confronted me before the situation got out of hand. I went on to tell him about how his wife had ruined Sweet Sensation. My father knew I was right, but he wanted to please his wife. He claimed I had no right to insult his wife, and by doing so insulted him. Well, I called Bernice a gold digger. In my own opinion, it does not count as an insult if it is what it is. I did not apologize for anything. My father then said there was not going to be any handover whatsoever. He asked me to go get a job, as Bernice would remain the manager of Sweet Sensation for as long as she wanted. I did not know how to react. He was trying to say I had spent 1 year of my life in culinary school, all for nothing. My mother's dream of establishing a thriving eatery was being gotten rid of by Bernice, and my father just stood by and watched. I told my father he was letting sentiment becloud his judgment, but Bernice quickly quipped that he was doing what every responsible husband ought to do: defend the interest of his wife. Bernice did not stop at that statement. She turned and reminded my father that she had told him severely it was bad having a grown-up son like me in the house would always cause rifts, as I would tend to forget who was in charge. My dad immediately looked at me and asked me to pack my stuff and leave his home, as I was old enough to take care of myself. The realization that my father was throwing me out hit me more than the insults his wife was tossing at me. So, I gathered from her statement that she had been suggesting to my father to get me out of the house since I was in culinary school. I'm currently staying with a friend, and I'm searching for a job. I know my father was right in saying I was old enough to live on my own, but would he have done so if Bernice was not present in my life? In all of this, my greatest pain is the fact that Bernice would bury Sweet Sensation. What's up, everybody? Mr. Reddito here. Oh boy, OP is in quite a pickle. Bernice seems like an absolute nightmare, but OP's father's doing nothing about it. Guys, I do have 4 updates for you, and let's go ahead and jump into update number 1. If you're new to the channel, click that subscribe button for daily videos. Here is update number 1. I'm in pain. While making this post, my pain is both physical and emotional. I just got bailed out of jail by my father, whose wife had me locked up. After my father kicked me out of the house, I found it difficult to get a job. I think the reason was because a greater part of me did not want any other job. My mind was simply set on Sweet Sensation and how it was gradually going out of business. You might say I'm obsessed with it, and you'd be right. Why shouldn't I be? This is my mother's legacy, for crying out loud. I could not visit the eatery as a manager or co-owner, as my father had put his wife permanently in charge. I decided to go there as a customer. This became my everyday routine. I discovered that Bernice had fired everyone who worked with me, as she perceived them to be enemies. She went on to employ new co-workers, and it was not like she treated them any better. My face became consistent, and I became a regular customer in the business my mother set up. A business I was supposed to be managing, ironic enough. Bernice had initially observed my visit to Sweet Sensation, and she ignored me as I was paying for every meal I ate, so she, however, soon became uncomfortable with my presence and approached me to ask me to quit coming. She said I was not needed as family members or client. My blood began to boil, but I kept my emotions in check. I was about to leave when she remarked that I was wasting my time and Sweet Sensation would never be mine. She said her son was my stepbrother and would be the future leader of Sweet Sensation, not me. Her statement was mean to provoke me, and it did just that. The previous issue that led my father to kicking me out of the house replayed itself. I began to attack her verbally. We started creating a scene again, and Bernice called the cops, who arrived within a few minutes. She claimed I was a stranger who was being a nuisance at her business place. So, the cops whisked me away, and the only place my explanation was heard was at the station. The police judged me to be at fault, as I had no business staying at a place after the owner had asked me repeatedly to leave. My father shows up at the station and bailed me out. He said Bernice had told him about my misbehavior at Sweet Sensation and how she had to call the cops on me as I was on the verge of physically assaulting her. The part of physical assault was a lie, but that is what Bernice is good at. My father said he was only bailing me out of jail as a final favor to me, and he warned me to stay away from his family for good. He said he would never interfere in my matter anymore and asked that I kept my distance. Hot tears rolled down my eyes as I looked at my father. He called bailing me out of jail as a favor. He went ahead to obtain a restraining order against me, and I made him a promise that he would never hear from me anymore because he was now dead to me, and I meant it. He didn't care. I turned around and left, and I'm nursing a broken heart and some minor injuries. I would have to pick up the pieces of my life together. Update number 2. Well, guys, it's been some time. It's been 2 years since my last update, and things I never anticipated are beginning to play out. I'd been receiving text messages from my father of lately, where he asked how I was faring and all. This was after 2 years of nothing but silence, and he even asked that we meet up at the Sweet Sensation just to catch up on lost time. He chose Sweet Sensation as he knew it held a sentimental value to me, but it did not work. I did not reply to any of his messages because as far as I was concerned, he was dead to me. After ignoring him for days, he finally showed up at my doorstep 2 days ago and said he wanted me to come to the manage of the eatery. I missed the business, but I was not willing to have my father back into my life. Besides, it was common knowledge that Sweet Sensation was almost out of business. The only thing about the business was that it was open with the doors. Doors which only a few customers ever came through anymore. I declined his request by saying I simply wasn't interested. Well, he did not push the matter. He only asked that we spent time together, and I was baffled by his request. I reminded him of his words to me the last day we met and asked him to stay out of my life as I was doing great without him. My father then began to apologize. He said his life had no meaning as he's lost everything that he's worked for over the years. This included money, family, everything. Well, I wondered what he meant by family since he still had a wife and another child, and my dad began telling me how he had discovered the true nature of Bernice. It was quite a story, and anyone with a little bit of sense would have seen it coming from a mile away. My father said Bernice had developed the habit of going on trips, and their son had fallen ill during the last one she embarked on. She wasn't around, so he had to rush her to the hospital himself. The doctor, after running diagnostics on my stepbrother, asked my father if there was a history of illness running in the family, and from what my father knew, there was none. Not in his family or that of Bernice's. So the doctor looked puzzled at my father's reply and proceeded to tell him that my stepbrother was exhibiting early signs of a disease called motor neuron, something just like diabetes that passes on from one generation to the next. My father then asked the doctor, well, let's run a DNA test. And that's when it was discovered that my stepbrother wasn't my stepbrother. My father was ignorantly raising the child of another man. So, he confronts Bernice, who did not deny the allegations. How could she, when there was hard evidence right here? She didn't even deny it. But she said she did my father a favor by marrying someone like him, who could be her father. She even went ahead to call my father a foolish man who would drive away his son simply because he wanted to please a woman. My dad filed for a divorce from her, and he was not required to pay alimony. He had become a lonely man, though, in these 2 years, and that was the reason he was trying to play dad. I sent him out of my apartment. I mean, yeah, his story's touchy, but I'm not touched. Update number 3. I'm finally finding peace that had evaded me for a while. My father had remained consistent in pleading with me to give him another chance at being the dad. Though I was still hurting, I decided to use the situation in my favor. I met with my dad to tell him about my decision to give him a second chance. My decision had a condition to it, though. He would will over Sweet Sensation to me. He would not just be a partner. No. And I would not just be a manager. I'm going to be the owner of the business, and this meant I could run it how I see fit and nobody would have a say in the matter. I was doing this because I could not let my mother's vision of establishing a popular eatery die with her. My dad was not hesitant in saying yes. He said he had already written his will where the eatery was to be passed on to Bernice's son if he died, but he's ready to call his lawyer to make adjustments. This was something he did within 2 days. His action showed me his seriousness to right his wrong, but the pain I still feel in my heart is too much to ignore. All the same, I was now the owner of Sweet Sensation, and my first move to bring it back to life was to pay Bernice a visit. Bernice lived outside the neighborhood, but it was not hard to locate her. I paid her a visit to the luxurious apartment which she had rented from the funds that she looted, and while at my father's house. I mean, come on. There's no way Bernice would have made the money required to live the lifestyle that she led on her own. She was surprised and unhappy to see me. She threatened to call the cops as she had done before, but I told her I would be gone before the cops arrived as my visit was intended to be a short one. I advised her to return the money that she looted from Sweet Sensation while she held the position of manager. Bernice laughed at me and claimed I was as stupid as my father when it came to reasoning. She asked me to leave her apartment and quit making a baseless accusation, or else she was going to sue me for defamation. So, I left her apartment without saying another word. I immediately sued her for mismanagement of funds, which would be appearing in court in a few days, and Bernice would pay for her actions. Update number 4. I'm at a place where I can say things are good, so this update, which is my last, would be a very short one. Bernice knew I was not kidding when she was served the court papers. I had gotten an auditor to make an internal audit covering the period when she served as manager, the day that we were to appear in court, but Bernice was not here. Every move to reach her proved futile, as her luxurious apartment was empty. There was no trace of her, and it was clear that she was on the run. A search was made for her, and she was found within a week. She was put under watch till the next hearing, and we finally appeared in court, and my father was one of the witnesses who were to testify against her. My lawyer had suggested so because my father's testimony of her unfaithfulness would establish the fact that her character was questionable. If she could be unfaithful in her marriage, the possibility of her being unfaithful in finances were really high. My father had agreed to stand as a witness. He was still in agony and anger over her deception, and this was his opportunity to get back at her. After my father's testimony, I presented the auditor's report. The discovery was staggering. Bernice had been taking funds generated from Sweet Sensation for herself and had accumulated a huge figure over 2 years. Bernice, in her defense, claimed my father had given her the go-ahead to use the money for her and her son's well-being. But my father refuted this claim. as he produced his bank statement, which showed that he had been giving her monthly allowances for her and her son's welfare. Bernice did not have much to defend herself. The matter got worse for her when the previous staff, which she had fired, testified against her. The case was over in about an hour, and Bernice got sentenced to 5 years in prison. She was equally required to repay the money she had siphoned in some compensation. Justice was served. But that was for Bernice. I'm still finding it difficult to relate to my father. That bond just isn't there, and maybe the father-son relationship could be established in the future, but it's been less than 2 months since I took over the running of Sweet Sensation, though there's still a lot of work to be done. The whole situation is encouraging, and what gives me joy the most is the fact that my mother's dream is coming back from the dead.
To be completely honest with you guys, I had my doubts that OP was ever going to have a normal relationship with the father again. And the reason I say that is because it just seemed like OP's father did not even care about OP. Well, I'm happy at the end of the story it all worked out, and that evil Bernice, which, by the way, everyone in the comment section absolutely hated. She got what she deserved, and now she's serving time in prison. So let me know from you guys, what would you have done if you were in OP's position and your father's telling you, you have to go to culinary school, but I promise, when you get back after 1 year, you can be the manager again. Well, that year came, and that year passed, and you're still not the manager. What would you do? Would you do what OP did, or would you do something a little bit different? Drop your comments right down below in the comment section, guys. I love discussing the stories with y'all. I'll see you in the comment section. If you're new to the channel, take a second right now. Just hit that subscribe button for daily videos. It's cool to be kind. I'll catch you guys tomorrow. See ya!